welcome or welcome back to the channel. I'm Judy and I love travel, history, and geography, and I use all three to try to understand why history happened the way it did. In 2025, my video blogs are taking you on a grand tour of France. France is packed with history and far more than I could ever include in my travel videos. It dates back all the way to the days before Julius Caesar and his legionaries came tromping northward, conquering the local peoples and converting what they call Provincia, today's Provence, into the first major Roman colony. The history continues to this day. This is the very first of what's going to be a series of fast fact videos. They're designed to give you a bit more background than I can include in the travel blogs, just enough so that if you're curious, you can understand more about the environment in which our subjects operated without bogging you down with a full forest worth of paper filled with explanations and dry facts. I do a lot of research. However, most of it never makes it into the videos. There's just too much for that format. So you should think of this video as a kind of starter to the travel blogs. Think of them as a short form of history. If you're still hungry and curious, you can dig even deeper on my Armchair Traveler WordPress blog. The link is in the description box below. For today, we're going to look at how and why the Kingdom of France evolved. This was a multi-generational operation. So grab yourself a beverage of your choice, kick back, and time travel with me, the Armchair Traveler, as your guide. To understand modern France, we have to rewind nearly 2,000 years back to the time of Julius Caesar. He called this region Gaul, and Rome's conquest here was brutal. Some tribes resisted, but the legions were absolutely unstoppable, disciplined, relentless, and always one step ahead of the local peoples. With every campaign, Rome imposed its will. It built roads, walls, aqueducts, cities, and added Latin to the mix. Gaul became Roman. But empires almost always want more, and that's their great weakness in history. Rome demanded crops, taxes, loyalty, and reshaped lives forever. The tribes adapted, learning to speak Latin, serving Rome, and even thriving under its protection. But cracks were always forming. History teaches us a pattern. No empire so far has lasted forever. Overexpansion, civil wars, plague, climate change, invasions, all of these things take a toll, and Rome suffered from all of them. By the 5th century CE, the empire was starting to stagger. Christianity, once outlawed, had become the state religion. Borders were stretched too far, armies too thin. And as the empire crumbled, new powers rose in the ruins. From that collapse, the roots of France began to grow. One of the darkest chapters in Rome's history began in 64 CE, when Emperor Nero blamed the Christians for the Great Fire of Rome. His accusations sparked nearly 3 centuries of persecution. Why were the Christians targeted? They refused to worship the Roman gods or the emperor, and that made them outsiders. As odd as it sounds to us, in a polytheistic world, their strict monotheism seemed intolerant. To the Romans, they were atheists. Not for denying God, but for rejecting the Roman pantheon. Suspicion grew and fear turned to violence. The worst persecutions came under Emperors Decius and Diocletian, especially during the Great Persecution of the 3rd century. Tens of thousands may have died for their faith. No one really knows the total. And yet, the more Rome tried to crush Christianity, the more it seemed to spread. Eventually, the emperors realized that they could not destroy Christianity, so they decided to embrace it. The turning point probably came with Constantine the Great. He became emperor in 306 AD and issued an Edict of Milan in 313, granting religious tolerance and making Christianity legal. He was only baptized on his deathbed, but Constantine became the first Christian emperor and was later canonized as a saint. Behind Constantine stood his mother, a woman named Helena. She was born from humble roots and married a Roman soldier named Constantius Chlorus. His rise through the ranks took him all the way to the level of co-emperor of Rome, placing their son, Constantine, in line for power. When Constantius set Helena aside for a more politically advantageous marriage, Constantine never forgot his mother. Once he became emperor in 306 AD, he brought Helena into the imperial court, honoring her with the title of Augusta. One of Helena's greatest legacies was her pilgrimage to Jerusalem, where she searched for pieces of the true cross, the very cross, it was said, of Christ. Fragments of that relic are venerated in churches across Europe to this day. She was canonized after her death and is remembered as the patron saint of converts and of archaeologists. As Christianity grew stronger, Rome declined. Popes had carved out their papal states, allying themselves with local rulers, particularly in places like the former province of Gaul. The most important alliance came in 496 CE when Clovis, the king of the Franks, converted to Christianity. Clovis's alliance with Rome benefited both sides. He could offer protection to Rome, and the church gave legitimacy and moral authority to him. Together, they laid a foundation for a new Europe, where the church was not only a spiritual force, but a kingmaker. The Roman historian Tacitus wrote about the displacement of peoples during the Roman Empire, saying, "Among the many calamities that have befallen the human race, none is more grievous than the flight of the people from their homes, driven by war and fear of destruction." Tacitus died in the 2nd century CE, but the truth of his words lives with us to this day. The Franks were a group of Germanic people living along the Rhine River in the regions we now call France, Germany, and the Low Countries. A Hunnish invasion of Frankish territory occurred during the early 5th century as the Huns, led by their formidable leader Attila, sought to expand their empire into Western Europe. The invasion prompted upheaval, including displacement of various peoples, including the Franks. The Franks themselves eventually settled in the area around today's Paris. Like the local Celtic peoples already in Roman Gaul, the Franks had their own culture and language, but existed in separate, disunited tribes. We get the name for their country from them. Romans initially viewed the Franks as a military threat and perceived them as culturally distinct and somewhat primitive compared to their own civilization, but that's just the Romans looking down their noses at everybody else. Over time, the Romans began to recognize the potential for political alliances with these people and became far more practical. Each of the tribes had its own leader until one man, Clovis, rose to unify them. Clovis claimed to be descended from a legendary figure named Merovich. That's where we get the term Merovingian. Clovis established the kingdom of the Franks, or Regnum Francorum. The kingdom became the foundation of medieval France. The man was a fierce warrior and a clever political leader. His conversion to Christianity around 496 CE was influenced by his wife Clotilda, a Christian Burgundian princess, and this was a turning point for him and his new kingdom. Christianity gave the formerly pagan Franks a shared identity and aligned them with the powerful Roman Catholic Church. Under Clovis, the Frankish kingdom grew to include much of modern-day France, including parts of Germany. Instead of bequeathing the kingdom to one man, Clovis followed the Frankish custom of splitting his inheritance among his 4 sons. Perhaps he imagined his boys would cooperate, but they did not. Instead of preserving peace and encouraging cooperation, they split their inheritance into 3 generally uncooperative subunits, still part, at least technically, of a kingdom of France. The 3 main sections were Neustria, the area around Paris and the Loire, and eventually including Aquitania, Austrasia to the east, and Burgundy. Over time, the Merovingians became weaker, and actual power shifted to royal officials. We call them bureaucrats, known as the mayors of the palace. The Merovingians were losing control over their kingdoms. The Merovingians built the largest and most powerful realm in Western Europe, securing Frankish dominance after the fall of the Romans. But their dynasty collapsed, leaving a power vacuum, one that would be filled by a new family of ambitious men remembered today as the Carolingians. 3 groups vied for control of what had once been Roman lands. The first were those Merovingian kings, royal in name but increasingly powerless. The second were their appointed nobles, called mayors of the palace, who actually ran the kingdoms from day to day. And third, lurking in the shadows, yet hungriest of all, was the Roman Catholic Church, which saw itself as a true heir of Rome. The Church, led here by Pope Zachary, faced a desperate situation. The papacy was surrounded by hostile Lombards in Italy and needed allies, powerful protectors to ensure its survival. Meanwhile, the Merovingian kings had failed, failing in leadership, in defense, and in governance. Knowing their limits, they relied on the mayors of the palace to rule in their stead. One of these mayors would change history. His name was Charles Martel. Martel was born about 688 and rose to be one of the mayors of the palace, in this case of Austrasia. More than an administrator, he was a warrior. His defining moment came in 732 at the Battle of Tours, when his forces halted a Muslim advance into Western Europe. The victory earned him the title Defender of Christendom and secured both the Christian states and the papacy itself. Martel never took a crown for himself, but he did spend time reforming the Frankish military, strengthening the role of the cavalry, and forged lasting bonds with the church. In 751, Martel's son, known to us as Pepin the Short, posed a daring question to Pope Zachary. Should the man with no power be king, or the man who actually holds it? Zachary, facing that Lombard pressure and in desperate need of allies, said, "Power belongs to the one who exercises it." With that blessing, Pepin deposed Childeric III, the last Merovingian king, and, with papal approval, crowned himself king of the Franks. The church had spoken, it was the kingmaker. In 754, Pope Stephen II personally anointed Pepin at the Abbey of Saint-Denis, one of my favorite churches in Paris, marking the first time a Frankish king was crowned by a pope. The ritual of holy anointing gave Pepin divine legitimacy and set the precedence for the divine right of kings. When Pepin died, Frankish custom split the kingdom between his sons, better known to history as Charlemagne, and his brother Carloman. Each considered himself to be the sole legal heir. Charles was the elder, born in 748, but there was a complication. Pepin and his wife Bertrada were too closely related under church law. Their marriage wasn't formally approved until after Charles's birth, casting a shadow over his legitimacy. And yet, from this contested inheritance would rise one of the greatest rulers of the ages, a man whose name still echoes through history, Charlemagne. Charlemagne transformed the Frankish kingdom, a vast empire stretching across much of Western and Central Europe. It was called the Carolingian Empire, and it marked the first time Western Europe had seen an emperor since the fall of Rome. Charlemagne wasn't just a conqueror. He promoted education, culture, and Christianity, sparking what we now call the Carolingian Renaissance. Charlemagne understood that power flowed through the church. He often demonstrated his devotion publicly, like here, commissioning churches where pagan shrines once stood. By doing so, he cemented his political control and his partnership with the Christian church. In the year 800, Pope Leo III crowned Charlemagne as Emperor of the Romans. The moment symbolized a fusion of Roman tradition, Christian authority, and Germanic kingship. For the Pope, crowning Charlemagne secured a powerful protector. For Charlemagne, it legitimized his rule and revived the vision of a unified Christian empire in the West. Charlemagne lived to the age of 72. Following Frankish custom, he planned to divide his empire among his 3 sons, but fate intervened. 2 of the boys, Charles and Pepin, died before him, leaving only the third, Louis the Pious. Louis was crowned as co-emperor before his father's death, ensuring the succession. Louis inherited the throne completely in 814 CE. A devout Christian, he tried to govern with religious ideals, but he lacked his father's strength. His reign was troubled by noble revolts and fierce disputes among his own sons. Louis planned to divide the empire among 3 heirs, Lothair, Louis the German, and Charles the Bald, on the theory that the brothers would help one another. But the brothers resisted sharing. Civil war erupted after his death, ending only with the Treaty of Verdun in 843, which split the empire into 3 kingdoms. Charlemagne's empire didn't last intact, but his legacy did. He laid the foundations for both France and Germany and reshaped the role of kingship and revived the dream of a united Christian Europe. Louis the Pious, son of Charlemagne, went ahead and followed the old Frankish custom of dividing his empire among his sons, Charles the Bald, Lothar I, and Louis the German. And by this point, you'd be forgiven for thinking that anyone might have realized that this was a bad idea. The notion was simple. Each son would rule a portion of the empire and work together as allies, but in reality the division led to rivalry, civil war, and fragmentation. Louis died on June 20th, 840, and before he was even cold in his grave, his boys were at one another's throats. Charles and Louis the German allied themselves against Lothair and defeated him at the bloody Battle of Fontenay in 841. That weakened his hold on the area and set the stage for peace. The war ended with a treaty in 843. Charles got West Francia, Louis the German got East Francia, and Lothar kept Middle Francia. When Lothar died in 855, Charles seized the opportunity to expand his control, eventually consolidating power and being crowned emperor by the Pope, who continued to act as kingmaker. West Francia, ruled by Charles the Bald, was the direct predecessor of modern France. It contained Paris, Normandy, and Brittany, lands that would define French identity. Over centuries, the West Frankish kingdom evolved through wars, dynastic changes, revolutions, and became the France we know today. But Charles the Bald's reign wasn't easy. Viking raiders plagued the land, forcing him to rely on powerful local nobles to defend the realm. He granted these nobles lands and titles in exchange for military aid. One such noble was a man named Ingilger, a Frankish lord who had fought the Vikings in the Loire Valley. In time, he became the Viscount of Anjou. And there you have it, the birth of France. And that's where we're going to leave the story today. From the chaos of Louis the Pious's divided empire to the rise of Charles the Bald and the birth of France, we have set the stage to meet a new dynasty. Next time on The Armchair Traveler Talks History, we'll journey into Anjou to meet Ingilger and his ambitious descendants, who we know as the Plantagenets. This family transformed a small county in the Loire Valley into an empire that stretched from Scotland to the Mediterranean, with one branch even ruling the Kingdom of Jerusalem. If you enjoyed this trip through history, remember to like, subscribe, and share. It helps me bring more journeys like this to life. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.